And it is my pleasure indeed that I can introduce Mary Carol Edwards and her talk tonight, Encountering Wetland Plants That Thrive in Challenging Gardens Like Yours. Like mine, like yours. Mary Carol founded Green Star Plant Farm, providing native aquatic plants for backyards to large restorations. She will speak tonight on plants for rain gardens and green infrastructure practices for saving water. She will discuss the National Index for Wetland Plants and why it matters to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and why it should matter to you. I told her before the presentation tonight that I'm really looking forward to her talk because I'm a blithering idiot when it comes to wetland plants. I think I know one. Pickerel weed. Pickerel weed? Yeah, pickerel weed. She'll feature 9 native wetland plants that are sure bets for the Gulf Coast rain gardeners. Her background, she has a BS in biology and an MA in architecture from University of Houston. And she worked for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension as a freshwater wetland restoration specialist. So I just can't seem to get this slide right. I forget to update part of it for the last 2 nights. Okay, we're going to Mary Carol's presentation. Don't forget to use the QA button to ask questions. And I'll be back if they haven't thrown me out of here right after Mary Carol's talk to help with any post moderation that I need to do with regard to the questions. So I'm going to unshare my screen. And just a second. I've lost it actually, the unsharing button. And, oh, there it is up top. It's jumped off of 3 screens here. Okay, I'm going to get out of here and I'm going to stop sharing. I think I'm going to stop sharing.
You're stop sharing.
Okay.
Ready.
Mary Carol, you're on. Go for it.
Oh, thank you, Russ. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you also to the Society for inviting me to speak today. I noticed that my prairie background behind me is missing, so there's a technical difficulty. But it doesn't matter. I'm going to get some prairie pictures up here in a moment if I can share my screen. Here we go. Okay. So as Russ said, I'm going to talk to you about some wetland plants, which are actually very tough and with a little care and a little planning can thrive in just about any garden along the Texas Gulf Coast. I feel like in speaking about native plants along the Gulf Coast, I should also acknowledge the native peoples of the Gulf Coast briefly. We had the Karankawas on the lands more or less west of Galveston Bay, and east of Galveston Bay we had the Akokisa people. As far as we know, they were not gardeners. They were more of they migrated seasonally, but the way that they interacted with the plant communities probably still affects us in some way. The legacy probably has reached us in some way. That would include prescribed burning and probably other techniques as well. By the way, if you find that the photographs here are in the wrong place so that your part of your image is covered, you can move them around, just as I've moved mine around. We do have some accounts of the way that the land looked way back when and the way that people experienced the land. And so I wanted to read one of those to you. This is by Frederick Law Olmsted, in a journal that he wrote while he was traveling across Texas. And here's his experience of the Texas Gulf Plains. By the way, if that name sounds familiar, it might be because you associated him with the designer of Central Park in New York City, and some campuses like Stanford and UC Berkeley, other places like that. Okay, so the year is 1857. He writes, "In this large district, extending from the Trinity River to the bayous of the Mississippi, it has throughout the same general characteristics, the principal of which are lowness, flatness, and wetness. The soil is variable, but is in a great part a loose sandy loam covered with coarse grasses, forming level prairies, which are everywhere broken by belts of pine forests, usually bordering creeks and bayous, but often standing in islands. The surface is but very slightly elevated above the sea, I suppose upon average less than 10 feet. It is consequently imperfectly drained, and in a wet season, a large proportion is literally covered with water. As in crossing it, even in a dry time, we were obliged to wade through many miles of marshy pools. The river bottoms, still lower than the general level, are subject to constant overflow by tide water. And what with the fallen timber, the dense undergrowth, the quagmires, the abrupt gullies, the patches of rotten or floating corduroy, and 3 or 4 feet of dirty salt water, the roads through them are not such as one would choose for a morning ride." So you can probably detect a little bit of travel weariness in that description. He'd been in the saddle for about 6 months at that point. But what you can also pick up is the vastness of the coastal prairie, and also the wet and dry interchangeable integrated landscape. And this is the key for gardening on the Texas Gulf Coast, this wet, dry transformation, constantly back and forth. You notice Olmsted described a loose sandy soil, a loose sandy loam to be precise, on the prairie. That sounds pretty nice to this gardener. You may have experienced or heard that all we have here is gumbo clay, but that's not really correct. That's not exactly true, because we do have a lot of variation in soil. We have some variation in topography. It's kind of hidden, maybe in plain sight. Let me show you a map of Galveston County here. It's a soil map. And you can see there's quite a lot of different kinds of soil that are designated. And although you probably can't read it on the screen, number 1 is described as loamy soils throughout. Number 2 is clay throughout, and so on. There's some soils that are loamy on the surface and clay underneath, and quite a lot of variety. That's on the large scale, on the county scale. If you get closer and look at a closer scale, you may acknowledge that there are smaller degrees of elevation. These are all just within a few inches or a few feet of each other, but they represent different soils and different topography. If you live in a 100-year-old neighborhood, you might be up on a kind of a high sandy ridge that was deposited by bayous. And it may have been the most preferable land 100 years ago before the topography was obscured by development. If you live in a house that was built in the 50s or later, you may be out on the coastal prairie, out on the plains. It is estimated that about a quarter of the land of the coastal plains was prairie pothole wetlands, these shallow depressional wetlands, often seasonally wet and seasonally dry. So there's a good percentage of a chance that your house is on top of one of these old prairie pothole wetlands under the builder soil. We also have random Mima mounds, which have kind of a light alkaline soil. We had prairie pothole wetlands, as I mentioned. They had a low oxygen hydric soil during the growing season, anaerobic soil. Along the bayous, we have gallery forests. We have salt pans in other areas, rich floodplains. About 99% of this diversity has been lost to plows and to bulldozers. So this makes your garden, challenging as it is, an important oasis for diversity. So let's look at some of these plants that might have been growing where your house is right now. Going with this 9 natives theme that the Native Plant Society has been using, I'm going to introduce you to 9 native wetland plants that have remarkable adaptability. The first set, big blooms. Our first plant is woolly rose mallow. It's in the hibiscus family. If you're familiar with any hibiscuses, you might be able to recognize that flower as a classic hibiscus. Sometimes it comes in pink, generally white, and it is about 3 to 5 feet tall, blooms in the summer, attracts pollinators, and in the wintertime, it will die back completely. The stems will dry out, and new growth will start up from the ground in the spring. So that stem that is overwintering can be a refuge for insects, generally hollow. So it's something you might consider not cutting back during the winter. Well, let's look at this photo, which kind of hints at its durability. That ground has been dry for a long time, but the plant is a little wilted, but blooming away, undeterred. It's kind of used to that treatment in the summer. Here's another member of the hibiscus family. It's the salt marshmallow. It has that same sort of behavior of dying back in the winter and leaving a stem, and then growing completely anew from the ground in the spring. It also gets about 3 to 5 feet, kind of an open, airy shrub. I think that you could probably cut it back and have it be a little more dense, flush back out with new growth. By cut it back during the growing season, I mean, maybe cut it to 2 or 3 feet if that's your preference. Otherwise, let it go. It's kind of got this nice hollyhock look, and we don't get hollyhocks in this area. The name marshmallow might make you think of the confection, and there's definitely a relation. The hibiscus and the marshmallow families all have a kind of a soft interior stem, or same material in the roots. And that was originally how they made marshmallows. This might look familiar to everyone. It's a southern blue flag iris. I have long thought that this was an ancestor, one of the 5 or so ancestral species of the Louisiana iris, but apparently this one doesn't combine with other local irises. Although I did hear that it combines with a very short iris called Iris brevicalis, the zigzag iris. So I believe there is a lot of hybridization going on. This one has a variety of blue flowers, tones of blue in the flowers. It blooms in March and is attractive to pollinators as well. It's got a nice quality of staying green in the winter. So here it is in February when everything else is kind of browned out. That's looking pretty good. And I'm moving my picture again so I can show you this one here. It's an example of this iris in really dry conditions. The soil is dried out. I think it was pretty organic, so it's probably holding some water under there. But you can see there's some new growth coming up in this plant, so it's pretty undeterred by these conditions right there and right now. It does prefer to have water though. I should say all these plants that I'm showing you have some preference for water. They will just have a tolerance for living in other drier places as long as you water them well when they get established. That's really the key to getting them established and having them thrive, is giving them the water that they need in the beginning until they're on their own. Okay, I want to get a little bit technical with you and explain how it is that some wetland plants can live outside a wetland. you know probably intuitively that you can't put a water lily and a rose bush together in the same bed and have them get, you know, have the water lily survive. But you could put, say, frog fruit in the same bed. That would be a really good combination. So why is it that some wetland plants can tolerate the different conditions and others can't? This drought tolerance became apparent really in the drought of 2011-2012. I should say apparent to me. This is when I was working at Sheldon Lake State Park as a wetland restoration assistant at that time. And it was so dry, it didn't rain between April and November, and it hadn't been raining much before April either. So we saw our wetlands become pretty dry prairies and scouring out. And we were really pleased in the spring when it began to rain again, and lots of plants came back. So we noticed that certain plants actually made it through that record drought on their own roots, on their own rhizomes. They were either very tough or they had these rhizomes that held just enough moisture for them to be able to get through those conditions. Other plants just dropped a lot of seed, and so they came back in another generation, and that's how they made it through the drought. So there is there's a lot of information to help you with your selection, but I want to point out the National Wetland Plant List. It's a list of all the plants in the country that are likely to occur in a wetland, that have been seen occurring in a wetland. If they never occur in a wetland, they're not going to be on the list. Every one of these plants is sorted into a category, which you see here. That's their indicator status. Up here at the top, you've got obligate wetland plants. Those are the ones that are obliged to be in water, either in standing water or in really saturated water. The next three categories are facultative. And that means the plant has a choice about where it wants to live. That's what facultative means. The first category, facultative wetland, means that the plant will tend to want to be wetter, but it has a choice. The next category, facultative, means it may be in a wetland, it may be in an upland. It's either or. By the way, you can see some numbers over here on the right. It says percent occurrence in wetlands. This is what the list used to go by, but they're moving away from that because it suggests that research has been done to develop these numbers, and really not a lot of research has been done on each one of the plants in the list. There's thousands of them, by the way. So they're just leaving these categories as open categories. The next two are for plants that prefer drier conditions, but they do show up in wetlands. The facultative upland here, they have a choice again, but they may prefer to be higher and drier in a prairie. And finally, upland. Rarely going to be found in a wetland, but you know, there is some variation. And I think that's kind of the beauty of this list, is that there's always that one freaky seed that's going to show up in some unusual place. I think all gardeners know this. We're used to moving things around. So this list kind of acknowledges that variability. So what good is this to the layperson? Oh, let me show you another slide here before I get to that. The list is broken down by regions here. And in Texas, we have three regions. We've got the arid West, we've got the Great Plains, and we've got the Atlantic and Gulf Coast Plain. That's a big region, but it's got a sub-region here called the Western Gulf Coast Plain. So here we are. And then you can look at the specific list for the Western Gulf Coast Plain. Let's look at a sample of that. It's got this long list here, many, many pages of wetland plants, and it's got its category here with its little code, and it's got a common name. The common names sometimes are not what you would expect. I think that's kind of typical of common names. If we really need to know what plant we're talking about, we go to the scientific name. So what good is this to a layperson? Well, imagine that you wanted to invest in a tree. Say right here, we've got Acer rubrum perhaps, depending on how your Texas Latin rolls out, red maple. If you want to get a tree and you wanted a fairly large size shade tree to get established, that's a pretty significant investment. Maybe $300, depending on the size, maybe $600. You've got to hire people to dig a hole, etc. So you want to make sure that it's in the right place the first time. If you have a glance at the list, you can see what conditions it likes. Here it says it's facultative. So remember that it's either or. It doesn't mind being in a wet, it doesn't mind being in an upland place. So this could give you peace of mind knowing that wherever you put your tree, as long as you did the due diligence to water it and get it established, it was most likely going to do fine wherever you put it. So that is one use of this list. And another one is something that Ben Pfeiffer referred to in his Fireflies talk last week. You know, he had this slide that said it had a list of FACW, facultative wetland plants, that support and provide habitat for fireflies. So if that's something that you would like to begin planting for and supporting fireflies, you could go to this list and see what else turns up as facultative wetland plants. And so increase your options. Is this list perfect? No, it's not. It has non-natives that are not designated as non-natives. And also, as I was prepping this talk, I realized that plants in a garden can tolerate more dryness than what is indicated on the list. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. But at this point, I wanted to see if there are any questions. I'm looking at the question screen. None? Well, this is your opportunity to jump in if you've got any questions. Okay, if not, we will just keep going. There's one. Yes, I'm going to be talking about rain gardens. I'm kind of setting the stage here for the rain gardens, and I hope that this next portion that I'm going to talk about, a little bit about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, is interesting to you. And then we'll look at rain gardens and several other green infrastructure techniques. Okay. This agency that keeps the list here, this is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so you might wonder, are they such plant nerds? Really? Maybe. But here's the backstory for why they keep the list. The Corps, the Army Corps of Engineers, has three primary mission areas: engineer regiment, military construction, and civil works. And civil works has also got three lines: navigation, flood and storm damage, and aquatic ecosystem restoration. So basically they're authorized to protect the nation's aquatic resources. So what does this have to do with defense? It's resilience. Felt like someone was going to say something. Okay, through two acts, the Rivers and Harbors Act and the Clean Water Act, Corps has certain jurisdictions over what is called the waters of the U.S., or WOTUS. You've heard of FLOTUS and SCOTUS. Waters of the Clean Act, waters of the U.S. is WOTUS. The Clean Act, the Clean Water Act, makes it unlawful to discharge any pollution from a point source into navigable waters, excuse me, unless a permit is obtained from the Corps. It's also unlawful to dredge or fill in portions without a permit. So waters of the U.S. are considered navigable, but they also include the wetlands that are alongside the navigable waters. So the question might be, where do the waters of the US end if they include wetlands? And we know that the wetlands have a kind of a quality of seeming like uplands in the coastal plains. So there's a practice of delineating where the wetlands end, and therefore the waters of the US, and where the rest of the world starts. So wetland delineation is determined by the soil, by the hydrology, and by the plants. And so this is where the wetland plant list comes in. All right. I'm going to skip any mention of litigation and mitigation. I feel that this is really something for another talk.
Mary
By the
Carol,
way, yes.
you have 3 questions now if you'd like to.
Yeah. All right. Is there a best resource on learning about Native American practices like prescribed burning? I don't know. I'm very curious. That's something that we could follow up with and send out to participants afterwards. Let's see, the wetland plant list is online, but is there a searchable database somewhere? You can download it as a PDF and then just do a Control F and enter part of a word and see what comes up. I don't know if you can get it as like a spreadsheet, so where you could just search for everything that was just facultative or facultative wet, which would really be helpful. What is the role of protein-eating plants in the low hydric anaerobic soils? Those carnivorous plants get their nutrients from the insects that they are able to entice into falling into the plants themselves. I'm not sure that this list includes those. But what is the role of protein-eating plants? I think that would be a great Native Plant Society talk in the future. Somebody bookmark that. I am now going to change the slide. Yes, I see the person sees only the list of plants. Here we go. Okay, let's look at plants again. Here we have sweet grasses. This big guy is Eastern Gamma grass. The plant you see there is probably 6 feet across. People say they get as tall as wide, but they generally don't. They tend to be wider than tall. It's an ancestor of corn. You might kind of be able to vaguely see that. The seed heads kind of give another suggestion of that, and that the seeds are kind of arranged in a sort of a very simple cob fashion. These are the flowers, very pretty. It gets pretty large, as I mentioned, but if it's mowed, it has that kind of finer textured grass. It's more palatable to cattle, deer, and other grazers. It makes good cover for wildlife as well. As you can imagine, you can fit a lot of quail under a plant like this. I'm looking to see if there were any other wildlife benefits that I noted. I find that with a lot of plants, the wildlife benefits are not well known or not well documented. They may say it's good for pollinators, but if you really want to know what the host plants are, what the pollinators are, other benefits, it's a little hard to find. So if somebody has a resource, I'd be glad to hear that. I'd be glad to know about that. Let's look at another. So this is Gulf cordgrass, one of a number of Spartinas that live in our area. This one is a nice clumping grass. It gets about 3 feet tall, and it rolls its stems into a tube, which is kind of pointy on the end. So just be aware when you're working with it, it's a little prickly. People notice that. They don't think that something that's kind of fine textured like that should prick them, but it's no worse than a rose bush. We have lots of garden plants with thorns, and this is just another one that knows how to defend itself. On the picture on the left, there's the Spartina spartanae, Gulf cordgrass, in regular garden soil right there. It is irrigated, but not regularly. It wasn't groomed for the picture. That's kind of just how it looks. You can cut it back and then you get a flush of new vegetation, kind of like with the eastern gamma grass. When it's recently cut back or when it's mowed, it's attractive to cattle and also to geese. They like the vegetation. All right, one more grass in our 9 natives. This is switchgrass. Many people have heard about switchgrass, but it's often hard for people to identify. And there are a couple non-native lookalikes. There's guinea grass and there's Johnson grass. But once you recognize them, you know that this is a different sort of species. It's really quite special. What you're looking at there is new growth in the spring, and it's coming up around the old winter seed heads. There it is in the late summer blooming. It's kind of got this maybe purple. It might be because Jen right there is wearing purple, but the seed heads are kind of a rosy color, very upright and attractive, and the seed heads attract birds. And the grass itself is also really good cover for small animals. And that photo shows the winter interest of this plant. It kind of keeps its form, and it has a light golden look there. Right there, it's in regular garden soil. So where should I plant? I'm going to give you some garden ideas, and they all have their roots in green infrastructure. Green infrastructure, I would say it's distinguished from gray infrastructure, which has a sort of a tendency to rely on concrete and drains and move water away from a property as soon as possible. The problem with that is that you kind of get a traffic jam downstream of water that's been rushed off of properties, and that's what leads to flooding. Green infrastructure, the purpose of that in the drainage, sense of drainage, is to hold more water on a property. It also has the purpose of being supportive of the wildlife. It's beautiful. So it's got these multiple functions. I think that in the city, in the infrastructure of the city, it's not an either or. You can't have all gray and can't have all green, probably, but a kind of combination of the two. And definitely in your own yard, you can favor the green infrastructure. The images I have here of the bioswales in the next couple slides and this one are developed on properties here where this is a good example. Between two houses here, you've got a low spot marking the division in the lawns. Imagine if this here had this developed in it. And there are also bioswales that are in a different configuration. They're along the street. So they're taking water from the street. They're also taking water from the lawn. They're purifying anything that's running off the street or the lawn. Bioswales are generally moving the water in some direction. So it's going someplace. Either it's going to another body of water or it's going to a storm drain. Here in the street, you can see that they develop curbs, especially for allowing the water to go into the bioswale here. These are good residential examples. You can see your liatris here, but this is actually in Illinois. This is in Oregon, or rather Portland, Oregon. These next slides are also bioswales, but they're just a little bit more design intensive. Midtown Park in Houston's got water feeding the bioswale from the lawn here and also from the park walkway here. There are drains in it, so it collects water and takes it somewhere, but before the water gets to the drain, it is nourishing these plants. It's being cleaned up by the plants and by the soils. And the same is happening here on Bagby Street. The water is accessing the swale underneath the walkway, through the walkway, off the sidewalks. It's fairly ingenious. Rain gardens are less of a conveyance than bioswales are. They're more of a recipient of the water, but they can also have storm drains underneath or French drains. There's a lot of variation in the terms, the bioretention, rain gardens, bioswales. The point is to hold water on the property before it leaves the property, or if possible, hold all the water. These images here are almost at the residential scale, but they were demonstration gardens, rain gardens in Dickinson near the library, at U of H, and in Pasadena. And my involvement with these was only tangential, but I came up with a design for the one in the Pasadena project site. And as you can see, there's just a few species. I counted them, there are 8 species here. You have a large swaths here where a couple species are down at the bottom, and then you've got other swaths where you've got some species that are a little more tolerant of upland conditions along the edge. Rain gardens can also take multiple forms. Conforming to the architecture, this is one that I did way back in 2006. And following the guidelines of moving the water away from the house, I had a low point here for the rain garden and a slope up to the foundation of the house. You can see there's iris in here and some crinums that are non-natives here, but at the time I was trying to plant more natives. You can also see that I had gravel here, kind of a stony area, and gravel up here. And I just want to say, in Houston, it's really not necessary to use a lot of gravel to cover the ground. It merges with the soil anyway, so it doesn't stay on the surface and it doesn't provide the benefits that you might think. It's better to use aged hardwood mulch, which doesn't float. And some other suggestions are for designing. Let me go back to the rain gardens. For designing rain gardens, I made notes. I lost my notes. You can do a sort of a minimalist rain garden with a little bit of digging or no digging in an area where the water tends to pool anyway. Or you can decide that you want to put a rain garden in an area which will require excavating. If your soil doesn't hold very much water, if your soil has good infiltration, let me put it that way, either because you've dug it out and you've put other soil in, or you just happen to be on one of those loamy soil types, maybe go deeper, 6 inches, 8, 9 inches would be fine. Or if you're doing the minimalist, no excavation, and you don't have very good infiltration, maybe just a few inches is fine. The point is to have the water evaporate or be taken up by the plants before the mosquitoes can breed. So within 24 hours is probably good draining time. It takes longer for the mosquitoes to breed. Put in compost for your plants. Take out the lawn or whatever is in there. Take out. Put in compost so that your new plants have some additional nutrition and the mulch, and that should be probably enough for the minimal version. There's more intensive where you add different soils, you add expanded shale, French drains, and so forth. All those techniques and methods are online. But just know that you have options. You can go simple, you can go as complicated as you like. More ideas. People sometimes say to me, I'm out of room, I don't know where else to plant. And I always think, nope, there is some other place to plant. So think about this. You may not be ready to replace your driveway, but maybe someday, or some alterations can be made. Either side of the driveway often drops off several inches. So, you know, depending on your creativity or your landscape conditions, you may have areas where you can plant on either side of the driveway. Basically, it's going to collect water and run it off some direction, probably down to the street, but you can also collect a lot of water in here and plant things like the frog fruit, or get creative. All right, our last set of native plants here. I'm going to call them must-haves, but I really think that they're all really desirable plants. Button bush, here we saw a slide of this earlier. Here it is up close. In the picture behind, it's definitely in an aquatic setting, but in this picture here, that's not water back there, it's a sidewalk. So it's growing in a lawn by sidewalk, pretty tough conditions, and doing just fine. This image here is a button bush with a really nice near half circle out of it. There's some also out of the leaves in the background. And the animal that did that is a leafcutter bee. It took this section here and it stuffed it into its nest as walls between the eggs, like in a nursery. So this is a wonderful habitat plant in many ways. Lots of pollinators are attracted to this, and it actually smells really good. This is one you don't see very often. It's a very small kind of sprawling shrub with these gorgeous blue flowers that are blooming right now. Here it is, peeking out right here in this marsh. Hydrolea's got little thorns, very small thorns, which makes it kind of unusual for a wetland plant. It's very tough. Sometimes it's the only thing blooming in a dry ditch at the end of the summer, and can be really quite beautiful. White top sedge here looks like flowers, but actually it is a sedge like nutgrass. And as a matter of fact, after it gets mowed, it's hard to find it. It looks just like any other kind of short sedge in a lawn. But fortunately, it blooms months and months from kind of like mid-spring way into maybe October. Its flowers in here, these bracts here are not actually the flowers, but they do attract the pollinators. They're trying to fool the pollinators into coming to these little flowers here. Okay, so what plant goes where? This section here kind of approximates either a bioswale or a rain garden, in that there's a very shallow slope. It says maximum ponding depth 6 inches. So you know that sometimes it's got 6 inches or maybe more going out the overflow, but a lot of times it's got less or none, no water. Your plants on the side can tend to be the ones that take drier conditions. So here you've got the ones that can choose to be either wet or dry, facultative, the ones that prefer a little bit more wet. And I'm also putting these on the list. Now the National Plant List calls these obliged to be in standing water, but I don't find that to be true. So I wanted to make note of that. I don't find that in nature, and I don't find that in gardens either. So take it with a grain of salt. The plants for the bottom can tend to want a little bit more water too, but I feel like those are probably overstated as well. They're more of facultative. They can kind of decide to be in a drier situation or less. I put these two here, even though they would do fine on the side. It's kind of a design decision because they just look like they should be at the bottom. The white top sedge is often at the bottom of a ditch anyway, and horsetail sedge looks better when it's at the bottom rather than side. All of these plants are in the plant sale. We also have some plants that probably wouldn't do so well in a rain garden or a bioswale unless you had developed a kind of an area for standing water, maybe 18 inches or so. These are all obligate. You've got a section that would do with just a few inches of water over their stems, kind of the way that this is depicted here. Some various rushes and some really beautiful flowering plants. And we do have two of the water lilies that would kind of go ideally at the bottom here. So they can grow in 12 inches, but if you give them 18 inches up to 6 feet, they're really going to be happy and show their stuff. Okay, let's have some questions. Okay.
Mary Carol, you've got several here.
Yes, okay, I see them. Brenda is asking, I have a spot that floods during drenching rains, but is also shady. Is there guidance for that? Yes, there's a number of wetland plants and some that are also on the list that on the sale list that can take shade. Lizard tail is excellent for that. Inland sea oats also. Without the list right by me, I'm not able to name some others. Maybe people could put those in the question and answer if they occur to them. But the sale list does a good job of describing the sun requirements and a little bit more about describing the plants. But yes, we do have plants that will do okay in wet, dry, shady areas. All right, Heather is asking, to plant any of these in compacted clay, does the soil need to be amended? I think you're going to make it easier on the plants if you do kind of break it up and amend it somewhat. It's just easier for the roots to get through. A plant that germinates on clay can often do better than a plant that is introduced to clay. So in nature, you may find things growing in incredibly clayey, tough conditions, but in your garden, maybe give them a little bit more accommodations there. How often are you replanting or reseeding a bioswale or a rain garden? That depends on what you plant. You can find a lot of flowering plants that will reseed themselves. And so you may be able to see that you don't have to replant or reseed at all. It's very important to keep the weeds out. If you just enjoy moving things around in a garden, you may find that you want to put more of the yellow plants on one side and the tall plants on another. So don't feel that you can't experiment with your garden. Let's see. Rawana is asking, can you can you tell what the grass planted in the bioswale on Bagby Street is? It looks like it could be either Cherokee sedge or Texas sedge. Without the seed head, it would be hard for me to tell either one. But the way that it's growing with that really fine sort of leaf looks a lot like one of those sedges. We may have Texas sedge in the sale, but we definitely have Cherokee sedge. Heather is saying, how many feet away from the foundation should the rain garden be? I think that it's often given 10 feet as a guideline, but realize when the rain garden is wet, so is everything else. And then the rain garden is going to dry out pretty quickly after. So I think the guideline is probably important, but it may also be because adding trees to the rain garden could impinge on the foundation. I think it's better to be more cautious than not, but it may be overstated, the distance from the foundation. Is Pennsylvania smartweed a good wetland plant? Pennsylvania smartweed, also called pinkweed, is something that takes a little less water than another one of the smartweeds that we're offering, the pond smartweed. Both of them are on the list. It's a good prairie plant for slightly wet locations. So yeah, that's a good one. A minimum size for a rain garden. I'm glad you asked that question. I think that rain gardens kind of mimic, or they can mimic, prairie potholes. And prairie potholes come in all sizes. Some of them are kind of the size of a kitchen table, and some of them are acres. I don't think there's actually a minimum size for a rain garden. It wouldn't be hard to experiment with that though. You could always go larger too. Start small, go larger. Let's see, would I go back to the deeper rain garden? Yeah. Let me go over here, see if I'm, okay. Can you see that? This is actually a pond or a bog. So we're in two different situations here. I wouldn't call this a rain garden unless there were some really shallow edges that were incorporated into this that could go dry, wet or dry. That's kind of the characteristics of rain gardens, is that they can totally dry out, but it doesn't mean that you can't combine these functions together. All right, I'll keep looking at questions. All right. Which of these would likely do well as far inland as San Antonio? Which part of town with similar attributes, clay loam, wet then dry conditions, and a need for green infrastructure? I know that San Antonio has its own website for green infrastructure, so there may be an associated plant list as well. I would say that any of the plants that you see on the plant list that have sort of like a facultative or facultative wet designation, you might consider those to be in San Antonio more obligate. As you maybe noticed on that map of the US, where I said that Texas is in 3 regions for the wetland plant list, San Antonio falls in the Great Plains list. So check out the Great Plains list and see if you can get some information from that. Okay, Lisa is asking, is Green Star Nursery open to residential gardeners, not just, oops, it popped away, professionals? Thank you for asking. We are open by appointment to residential gardeners. We'd love to have people come and show you what we've got. We're hoping that we'll be in the new place in Alvin in October. Our detailed timeline puts us in October. The person who is experienced with construction in me says November, but we will keep putting information out on our website, and we also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. All right, Lashway is saying, we are in a HOA subdivision. We really like the idea of the bioswale for the drainage in between properties. Have you seen success with HOA dealings? I'm assuming that they wouldn't like to see it. I mentioned that there's a lot of information that you can get online, and a lot of the information on bioswales and rain gardens is actually put out by other cities. So this may be a way for you to approach your HOA to show people what has been done in various cities around the country. And Houston has an upcoming incentives for green infrastructure. It's, my understanding is that it's under development now, so stay tuned. This may be another way that HOAs can be introduced to the idea. And I think that the more of these green infrastructure examples that we get in neighborhoods that are beautiful and effective, then we can use those as demonstration projects for other subdivisions. So I appreciate you sharing this idea with your HOA, and I wish you good luck. All right, Elizabeth has a question. Let's see. She has a spot right by the back porch that gets a ton of water during storms, so much it can fill a couple large plastic trash barrels in less than an hour. We have no gutters and we're worried about the foundation of our home. Can we create some kind of bioswale to catch that? Yes. It comes down so hard and fast from a single corner, I'm afraid it might break or smash the plants. I think in the area where it falls, you'll need to break the force of that water some way. It may be by adding this is a good place for stones. I mentioned not having gravel before, but stones or something to break up the flow, the force as it comes down, and keep erosion from occurring there would be one way to do it. I'm not much of a home designer, but I feel like there might be things that could happen on the roof itself before it gets to the ground. And yes, I think pulling the water away seems like a great opportunity for one of these green infrastructure ideas I've been sharing. Linda says, tell us some more about your plant farm and where is it? We specialize in native wetland plants. And right now we have a temporary nursery that's in the East End. It's on Navigation Boulevard. We don't have a sign, but if you go to the website, Green Star Wetland Plant Farm, greenstarwetlands.com, there's our contact information. We often like to show people around on Fridays, but if that doesn't work for you, we can set up another time. And we're developing a farm right now in Alvin, and it's about a mile south of Highway 6. It's close to the Froberg family farm, where a lot of people have grown up picking strawberries. So that may be a landmark for you. Really beautiful piece of land, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with people soon. Sarah says, do I know what causes those prairie potholes? I don't think anybody really knows, but there are a bunch of theories out there from eons of blowing sand to mammoths rolling to, you know, scratch. So they're still kind of mysterious and more rare. And I think I'm hearing, did I read that Russ wanted to answer? Okay.
No, I was just trying to clear out, because you have two more here.
Okay, well, thank you. Nancy, hi Nancy. She says, can you show the EIH rain garden again? Yes, I'll go back to that, but I'll answer Megan's question here. Do you have any favorite online resources for planting plans for green infrastructure? I don't. I think that your planting plans really have to be tied to the land itself. And so you study the light, observe where the trees are on your land, where the buildings, and kind of come up with something that's custom. There are people who can help you with developing a design if it doesn't seem like all those moving parts are something that you can handle. There are several people who are doing ecological design, and next month, one of them will be speaking to the Native Plant Society. So reach out and get help if you can. But if I'm understanding you correctly, looking for a resource that might end up like a cookie cutter approach to your property probably will not get you the result that you could have. So go for a custom approach. Okay, Nancy, I'm going to page back in my presentation to the EIH garden. Past the driveways. There it is. Okay, so it's the one here on the right side, and I don't think it had been planted very long. I went and took some pictures, some more close-up pictures about 6 months after it had been planted, but unfortunately wasn't able to find those. Russ, do I have any other questions?
No, you don't. So I have to say thank you so much for your presentation. It's been great to not be an idiot now when it comes to wetlands plants. I've got some options.
You do.
Thank you so much for coming to Wildscapes and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you for having me.